Welcome to tonight's event. There is my voice. Okay, that carries a little bit better. My name is Franziska Plümmer. I am one of the moderators for tonight, but as you can hear, my voice is not at its best. So I'm just going to do the welcoming remarks and introduce the speakers for tonight's discussion on the EU, China, and international standard making. And I am assistant professor for Europe-China relations at UVA, and within the European Studies department we have a focus on geopolitics of technology, and in this focus and series we planned this event, and we're very, very lucky to have the speakers here to talk about the politicization, importance, and futures maybe of standard making in international realms. We have here, first of all, Xiao Zhongrui. Thank you for coming. Is joining us from the VU, the other infamous university in Amsterdam. She's a specialist in many different things. She is currently working on the interplay of AI technologies and state governance, AI application in the judicial bodies. So she's coming from the legal sphere, particularly also interested in one aspect that drives us today is the question of public and private partnerships, or public-private bodies in data processing in the EU and China. So we actually forced her to continue this line of work for tonight. So we're very happy to have her. To her right, we have Daniel Fuchs joining us from Humboldt University in Berlin, where he is working on China's role in international standard making. So also he's perfectly cut out to talk about the issues of tonight. He has worked on the German and Chinese partnerships in industrial standards particularly, but also more largely on China's role, or is currently working on China's role in the international arena. And last but not least, we have Roger Kremers, who is joining us from Leiden. The Leiden Asia Center is his home. And he has famously worked on the Chinese social credit system, so different aspects of Chinese technology and internet governance, and has also published last year can I call it a working paper series on China's approach to domestic standard setting, where he looked at standardization of 6G and AI specifically, and also something that we can maybe discuss today, argued that China is no longer a technology taker, but a technology maker. And I think this is one of the questions that drives us in how that actually plays out. The moderation for this event will be conducted by Niels Tenhover, who's my colleague from the European Studies department, who's also very well read and published on all things internet governance and internet resources. So I'm very happy for him to jump aboard here, and I'm eternally grateful for you. Give us a warm round of applause for our speakers, and then the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, everyone. Great that you're here. I guess you don't have any presents waiting for you at home with Sinterklaas, so I don't know what that says about our audience. I hope you haven't been naughty, or at least will not be so tonight. We're going to start off this evening about this exhilarating topic by first giving everyone the opportunity to give a short introduction to their work. But I'll first ask Rogier to tell us standards. What are they?
One of the easy questions. When we say standards, we can mean many different things. But in general, standards fall into two buckets. On the one hand, we have what we could call minimum standards, and these are quality levels that a product or the process by which it is made must meet in order to be on the market lawfully, for instance, or in some case ethically. So we can have standards. We even have standards on how many bits of insect there can legally be in bread, because the way that we harvest grains means that we're all eating a few ants every now and then, ground up small. But also, when we talk about ethical standards, we can talk about labor standards, under which conditions are products produced. These, however, are not the standards that we're going to talk about today. Today, we're going to talk about one very specific kind of standards, and those are technical standards. And the idea with technical standards is not so much that you sort of set a norm on quality of the product. Rather, the goal of a technical standard is to create interoperability. So a technical standard is best described as a specification, a recipe, as it were, to make particular products in such a way that they can work together. And some standards can be very, very simple. Every time that you plug in an electric appliance into a socket, you can do that because the plug and the socket are both manufactured according to standards. That means that you can buy, any electric product that you buy in a Dutch shop, you can plug into the wall, right? It gets a little bit more complex when we talk about the internet, where the standards that govern the internet, or at least the technical functioning of the internet, have to ensure that packages of information can be sent from and received by any other connected device as long as they are standards compliant. Similarly, with 5G, we will have a whole range of devices that, as long as they are compliant with the 5G standards, regardless of whether it's a smartphone or a smart car, or as Baidu at some point was experimenting with, a pair of IoT chopsticks with built-in sensors for toxins in food, as long as these devices have been designed to work with a technical standard, then they can be interoperable. So that means that standards can actually be very powerful devices from a market perspective, right? If you are part of a standard that gains wide market currency, for instance, in a standard like 5G, you are part of the creation of an entire ecosystem. Standards very often in these advanced tech applications consist of technology that is still patented. So every single, for instance, Huawei owns about 10% of the standard essential patents for the 5G standard. We don't quite know how that breaks down in value, but let's say for the sake of the discussion, it's also 10%. It means that every single time that a 5G device gets sold, regardless of who makes it, Huawei cashes 10% of the intellectual property fees, the royalties that are paid for that standard. So standards can have very important economic impacts. Those of us who are old enough may remember the VHS versus Betamax war, which was essentially the point where the market had to choose whether for home video records we were going VHS, which is one standard, or Betamax, the other standard. VHS won, actually by and large thanks to the pornography industry. Betamax didn't, and that means that everyone who bought a Betamax recorder, all of the R&D, all of the production costs that went into the tapes, the recorders, the marketing and all the rest of it, that's just wasted. If you were in the VHS business, obviously, then you were coining it. But standards may also have lock-in effects. I don't know how many of you have ever sort of started out with an iPhone and then switched to Android or the other way around. But once you tend to be in a particular technology paradigm, you tend to stay within that technology paradigm, which means that the initial companies involved in the standard setting may well have a sort of an installed market base for whatever may be the next iteration of that technology. And that can then, for instance, have political effects. For instance, we're all talking about how do we deal with the impact of the presence of Huawei or Huawei technologies in our telecommunications stacks. So standards, starting with an economic effect, can then develop a political effect, can have a security effect depending on how the standard is designed and what it is optimized for. So you have different wireless standards which may be optimized for different things, speed or security, for instance, ease of encryption. And so it is not a completely neutral question which standards wins out in the marketplace. Lastly, standards can be very powerful carriers of prestige. And when you study international politics every so often, as I do, you know that prestige is pretty much the currency of international relations. It's one of these things that states pursue. And to be seen as a country that is a setter of standards thereby carries that sort of intangible worth that apparently governments will go to quite some lengths to pursue. But at the heart of heart, standards are technical specifications that are there to ensure that different objects, different products, different services can work together seamlessly from a technical perspective.
Thanks so much, Rogier. Do we feel we're down with what standards are? Yes. Very good. So now we set the ground basis. We got this far. Now let's go to Daniel to tell us a bit about your own experience. How does China play into this, and what makes that different?
Yeah, thanks at the very beginning to Franziska and the entire team for the very kind invitation and for bringing me over from Berlin. From HU, Humboldt University. I would like to start to introduce a little bit our own work at Humboldt University at the Institute for Asian and African Studies on Standardization, because maybe in contrast to how Rogier now sort of presented it, because he did that in a very fascinating way, others speak of standards as a field of boredom. I don't know if some of you know the science fiction author and journalist Cory Doctorow, who also writes about internet hacking and related things. He once spoke or wrote about standards in the sense that standards have a shield of boringness around them. So this is why no one really wants to deal with them. And this is problematic because, as we just heard, standards are incredibly powerful. So how did we get to do research on something that is covered by a shield of boringness? By accident, to be honest, and I think there are also many students here today. That's how research, if you haven't experienced that so far, very often works. You are in the field, you discover something, and then your entire research plan might change. So together with my boss, Professor Sarah Eaton at Humboldt University, we initially, back in 2019, were interested in the cooperation between Chinese and German stakeholders on Industry 4.0. You might have heard about that. Others speak about smart manufacturing. Since there is such a cooperation on a pretty high level, inscribed in an MOU as well between the two governments. But based on a first fieldwork trip just before COVID in December 2019, where I did interviews with private but also public representatives in China, I realized that both in Germany and in China, the thing that matters most with regards to this Industry 4.0 cooperation is standards. The other topics were not seen as that important by far, and everyone kept going on about standards. And this is practically how we developed an interest in that. And then we worked first on this cooperation between China and Germany, and I'm going to say maybe in a second round more about that. So why are China and Germany actually cooperating on Industry 4.0 standards, given that standards have become a topic that is at the center of the geopolitical rivalry that we're seeing at the moment in the globe. And then we moved on and did some research on the so-called US-EU Trade and Technology Council that was established in 2021, and we worked on the ESS, the European Standardization Strategy. Last month, we have started a new 3-year research project that was funded by the German Research Foundation that has the complicated title maybe, Pathways from Rule-Taking to Rule-Making, a comparison of China's and Korea's internationalization strategy for digital standards. So we're going to work for the next 3 years from a comparative perspectives on matters such as standards for 5G, 6G, AI, self-driving vehicles, and so forth, and looking at both Chinese and German stakeholders. And one final sentence here in this very long introduction, because it's very recent news. Professor Eaton has just received an ERC Consolidated grant, which means that we have, or the team and she, most importantly, has further funding for the next couple of years. So we're going to stick to that topic. If I still have time, then I would...
You have 4 more minutes.
4 more minutes, perfect. Because I think sort of when we talk about, you know, China's role and China's strategy in international standardization, we have to provide a little bit of broader context. Again, Rogier did that, I think, in a fantastic way to tell us what standards are actually about, and also why standards are powerful. There is a German researcher, and I think you alluded to him, Tim Rühlig, who differentiates between different dimensions of standardization power. Along the lines of what Rogier just said, they have economic, legal, political, but also ideational, discursive power dimension to them. And Leora Salter, back in the 1990s, and I really like that quote, said accordingly, standardization is like housework inasmuch as it is both essential and unrecognized in the constitution and reproduction of economic and class relationships. And that quote brings me to sort of the next part that goes beyond the power of standards, which is that the institutional configuration of how standardization works on different levels, from the national to the global level, contributes to the reproduction of unequal relationships between powerful economic actors and less powerful economic actors or states. So if we look at the global level, then there is a clear dependency of so-called global south countries and companies in these countries, private companies in these countries, from global north actors, which since the early beginnings of international standardization, more than a century ago, keep dominating that field. In fact, I would say that apart from China, the only other state or companies from a specific state that managed to move from a so-called rule taker to a rule maker over the past decades was actually South Korea. So there's China and South Korea, but that's basically it. Other than that, sort of it has been for a very long time that key company or companies from key countries in the global north dominate the development of standards and the process of standard setting. And this is why the case of China is so interesting. And this is why I would also say we talk now about the politicization of standards, because now there is a global stakeholder or an array of global stakeholders that put into question specific power relations in the negotiation of standards that dominate our life in various ways. Now, how has China, and maybe in 2 minutes, and we can continue that because it's a huge topic, but how has China...
Half a minute.
Or half a minute. How has China actually managed to do that? That's a huge question for itself. Research projects have been conducted on that topic alone. I would, for now, only want to highlight that if we look at China's evolving role in standardization, it's important to both look at the domestic level, at the reforms of China's standardization system that actually put it in a place where it could then be influential enough on the international level. And we can talk about the details later. And secondly, China has been very active on the international level in two ways. China has been following what can be called a two-pronged engagement. On the one hand, the Chinese state, the Chinese party state, and Chinese companies are investing heavily in the participation in international standardization organizations, SDOs, standards developing organizations, such as the ISO, the ISC, and other organizations. So there's heavy state-supported, promoted engagement in these international organizations on the one hand, but on the other hand, there is also the attempt to expand and to export, if you like, Chinese national standards beyond these existing international institutions. I hope we can continue that conversation later, but for now I would stop here.
Excellent. Ciao.
Yes, what's your question to me?
How do we go from here? So we see China as a rising actor. Is it integrating well? Do we see resistance from the global standards, or is it a competition between nation states under a veneer of global cooperation? How should we analyze it?
Yeah, thanks. Before I share some of my observations with all of you, I'd like also to extend my thank you to the UI colleagues, especially Francesca, for making this happen. And also, thank you for coming. For, I don't know, prioritizing intellectual gift over interclass gift. As you see, I'm Chinese, so when I look at China-EU relations combined with my background in law, I don't treat China or EU as an entirety, as one decision maker. I always look at, instead of taking standards as a given, I look into how standards even comes into existence, what are about the consultation process, what are different opinions, and how those different opinions finally confirmed in the form of law. And when you have the law, then different actors come in and they treat law as a tool, as a guidance, and how do they comply what is written on paper in their day-to-day practice. So that is my perspective. And when it comes to the China's involvement with international standard setting, I'd like to share one of the experience of collaborating with the Chinese legal professionals. Right before Corona, we had the opportunity to host a delegation of Chinese court presidents who visited the Netherlands. Of course, I spoke both English and Chinese, so I translated for the delegation. We did that part as the preparation, what kind of questions they had. And I also tried to convey their questions to the Dutch jurists and the law scholars in the meetings. The purpose of the delegation was quite clear. They always asked about how do you manage the court? How do you, especially in the field of intellectual property law, how can you make sure the reviewing and the deciding procedures were efficient, were well received by the applicants? Because that was and still is a big challenge to the Chinese courts. Either the whole court procedure is not well trusted, or when they are trusted and receive a case, the applicant more than often complains about the law process. So they wanted to learn. So how do you do that as one of the most advanced judicial systems in Europe? A bit to their disappointment, the context was so different. And the Dutch judges were not really under the huge pressure to conclude 5 cases per day as the judge in China would do. And then the delegation from China changed their question. So, okay, if your judges and my judges have different workloads, so how about the application of the e-justice? I know the EU adopted this e-justice using AI technology, helping the delivery of justice in different member states. So could you tell us, how do you do that? What kind of good technologies you have? And then the Dutch team responded, well, this is quite straightforward. We don't. Yeah, so I want to share this example as part of, I see this lack of how we understand China as international audience, as researchers based outside of China. Our sources of information are most likely either news reporting or research literature. And they do not capture the very dynamic context in China, different actors looking for good practices and wanting to improve their work. And that is, to me, is a big pity. When we understand China, we always use very simplified narrative. China is one voice, one decision, as if all the agencies in China are somehow programmed to act in a very authoritarian way without looking at the rules, practices in other parts of the world, which is not true. And that is a big challenge to work of academia. Sometimes if you want to convey the necessity of engaging Chinese lawyers, judges, the question we have to convince the funding parties here is, are you sure you are not doing something evil? Are you sure you are going to do something good? And that normative suspicion is quite widespread here. And that is a big hurdle to research projects or any application efforts we have. So that is the first point I want to make. China as an object of discussion is quite dynamic, is multifaceted, containing different actors. And you have to always specify your audience, your targets, your collaborator about their motives, their problems, and their agendas. The other thing I'd like to add from my background in law and governance is the overarching agenda in China, which is modernization. And by modernization, I really mean to modernize both infrastructure, like what we can see in the street, and also the working procedure, how to make sure the working procedure domestically is efficient, internationally is up to different set of rules. Chinese central government has been quite concerned with the competence, how to make sure the whole governance entity would be perceived as capable, as able to govern the Chinese society well. The same group of people, they also had the huge pressure from the central government, try to make the whole court procedure quite accessible, quite trustworthy. How to do that? Around 2013, the Supreme People's Court, which is the highest court in Beijing, introduced the so-called Smart Court Initiative, where more than 3,500 local courts would be sooner or later implementing or joining this national data infrastructure, in which the registration of case, the deciding of the case, and the monitoring of the case will be all done in this platform. Roger actually has just published a book. If I don't misunderstand the topic, you will touch upon this judicial smartization initiative in China. The court, the leading delegate from this group, the man standing to my left, President Gong, he humorously stated, as a court manager in China, I'm more active in combating IP thefts cases involving Chinese companies than the WTO. Why? Because China has already made it clear, instead of positioning itself as made in China, as the world factory, it wants to shift the whole strategy from made in China to renovated in China. And renovated in China. So made in China is not the strategy or the ambition of the Chinese government anymore. Now, the central government wants to make sure China will be the leading power in this technology, AI, everything innovative. And in that whole effort, you have a lot of disputes coming in, and the court has to make sure if you have local disputes, it should be resolved locally. If you have disputes containing foreign investors, instead of going international like WTO, the local courts should have, first of all, it should be trusted, and second of all, it should be professional enough to resolve the disputes efficiently and creditably. So that is on the top of the Chinese court's agenda by using AI technology, try to make it more efficient and more trustworthy. And the overarching goal is to make sure the governance competence of China will be sustained.
Thank you. There was a lot in there, and we have a lot to discuss. So one thing you touched upon is, or at least alluded to, were some of the claims that that in geopolitics have been made about Chinese intention about 5G. And so I'd like to ask to Rogier, so these claims about 5G, but also about new IP, have they hampered China's ascension into global standardization been going on since the ascension in the WTO, or stimulated China to do it even more?
Your timing is excellent, just when I'm having a big sneeze. It's interesting that you talk about new IP. Full disclosure, I am funded 1 day a week by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs to help them out with, understanding what's going on in Chinese digital policy and how they can then make policy on the basis of that. And one of the biggest jobs that I've had over the past couple of years is to convince them that new IP is a nothing burger. And that, all of this breathless reporting around new IP where China is going to take over the world. It's this sort of, there were these reports in the Financial Times where the Chinese have got a new standard for the internet and they're going to ram it down all of our throats at an ITU meeting within the next 6 months, and they're going to install a new internet that is designed for authoritarianism. Well, firstly, I've been studying the Chinese internet for the last 15 years, and I must say that even under the current technical state of the internet, the Chinese government has been able to put it to authoritarian uses quite successfully. So I don't necessarily think that they would be investing billions in, in an authoritarian internet when that's what they already have. But more broadly, when we talk about the technical standards that make the internet work, the current thing that we have is essentially the IP system, the Internet Protocol. Now, there has already been one shift in the standard. We used to only have IPv4, Internet Protocol version 4, and at some point in the 1990s, it was decided that we need a bigger version, because the problem with IPv4 was that it had a limited set of combinations, and so a limited set of addresses that would not be enough to connect all devices. IPv6 is longer, it also includes letters, and that creates far more addresses. You could almost say if a telephone number only has 3 digits, it means only 1,000 people can have a phone. If it has 10 digits, then obviously way many more people can have phones. And that's a shift that was politically completely uncontroversial, right? It was an engineering problem that required an engineering solution. And I know you're slightly cringing, but one needs to sort of, this wasn't a geopolitical issue, let's put it like that. Niels, you know this. How long has it taken to go from the decision to get started on IPv6 until its full acceptance as an internet standard that could be used?
Oh, the negotiation started in 1992, and in 1996 was a standard, and it's now deployed over half the internet.
No, but the point is, the project started in 1992, right?
Yes.
And I believe it only gets accepted as a full internet standard 2006, somewhere?
No.
By
1995, the first version.
Yes, but I remember there was something in it where...
The IPv6 extension.
Yes.
Yes. But
Anyway, point is, I actually checked this 2 months ago. Google has an analytics page. Less than 40% of traffic to Google is IPv6. And this is 30 years after we started doing this. So from that perspective, the idea that China could ram this new internet standards down the throats of the world, which isn't backwards compatible, and so would essentially also probably require a replacement of a large part, if not complete, technical substrate of the internet, is just ludicrous. Yet we seem happy to believe it. You know, this is something that has gotten a lot of traction in the digital policy community that isn't the technical policy community.
And the same has been true. There have been no backdoors found in 5G standards thus far. The only people who standardized surveillance in 5G have been Europe and the US. But how has this impacted standardization of the Chinese participation in standardization?
Well, and that is the really difficult thing to say, because new IP essentially is a figment of the imagination of panic mongers who want consulting incomes. The 5G standard has been set, and Huawei is in it. Part of the problem is that, as we already discussed, standards are being set in hundreds and thousands of utterly and extremely boring standardization bodies. And as Chinese technical development capabilities are increasing, it is logical that Chinese companies play a bigger role, and Chinese research institutions play a bigger role in these international processes, right? The problem is that we very often think that these are centrally guided efforts, but they're really not, in the sense that there is no one office in China that sort of coordinates the activities of these thousands of Chinese participants, whether they're individuals, whether they're companies, the research institutions, think tanks, God knows. There is, you know, that isn't happening.
That's very interesting.
How do you know?
Because I've been doing this for 15 years. And I haven't found it. So either they're hiding it really, really well, including from themselves, or there's nothing there.
I want to go over to Daniel and ask, if you're studying the collaboration between China and Germany on standard setting, and China has this myriad of practices in standardization, how does this collaboration take shape, and what does it look like, and how does it work?
Yeah, as I said at the very beginning, we were interested in that because at the outset it looks a little bit contradictory, right? So if you open the newspaper, you might not first read about standards, but you might not have to go through a lot of pages to read about geopolitical rivalry, China versus the US, China versus Europe, and so forth. And that is happening at the same time as an ongoing standardization partnership between China and Germany. What we looked at is the partnership on Industry 4.0 standards. It has to be mentioned that there is more technologies that China and Germany are cooperating on. For instance, new energy vehicles would be another example where since, I think, 2017, this cooperation is taking place, and on a regular basis, specialists, standard developers, engineers, private business reps from China and Germany are meeting and communicating. Now, when it comes to Industry 4.0, I think we were then, mostly interested in what are the actual motivations and what are the actual interests behind those two sides, both behind the Chinese side, why do they want this cooperation with Germany, and on the German side as well, if we are in a context of geopolitical rivalry, why is there a willingness to actually cooperate on such a such an important and potentially far-reaching set of technologies. Now, what we found, I think, is pretty interesting. So we tried in a paper that we published in the journal New Political Economy, I think officially in 2022 it came out. We tried to conceptualize this cooperation by using the lens of practices. So we understand standardization and the whole process of standard setting as made up and constituted by a variety of practices that have to be learned by actors who try to engage and who try to have influence. In other words, just technological expertise, just R&D funding by large companies would not be enough to actually exert influence in these boring technical committees, as was mentioned already, right? So there's a little bit more to it, and we need to, or we argue that we need to look at sort of the level of practices. And it's very hard to summarize the argument in a couple of sentences, but for what we found based on dozens of interviews with participants on both the Chinese and German side is, first of all, for China, it's very important, or as you Tsunguri said, it's always a problem to say for China. So when I say China, I always mean a specific set of actors in that specific field, because I completely agree with what Tsunguri said. But for the Chinese stakeholders we interviewed, the first important thing was to learn the rules of the game, to learn actually how interactions take place in an ISO technical committee, how you actually go about leading a secretariat within the ISO or in other institutions. And we found that the cooperation with Germany is seen as key, or one part of a key strategy to actually put Chinese engineers and standard developers together with people that are much more experienced in exactly these practices, and to learn about how do you actually behave in these international organizations. The second sort of aim that we highlighted in this piece of research is to overcome discursive barriers. This might sound a little bit dull, because it is, the most basic set of it is learning the language that these conversations are being held in, and this this is mostly English, and this has to be learned. This has to be practiced. Common conceptions and conceptualizations of key terms in the technology have to be found. They might be very different in different countries, and even in different companies within the same sector. There might be a lot of confusion. You have that, by the way, also when you have a meeting of US standard and like engineers and German engineers, you will come up with the same problem. But overcoming these discursive barriers, meaning learning the language, as in actual the English language, that is the technical English language that is used there, but also common definitions of concepts, is also something that Chinese stakeholders aimed at or are still aiming at with this cooperation. Improving the technical expertise, of course, as the third part, learning from German engineers that work under the star of the discourse on Industry 4.0. And finally, also gaining knowledge of the existing standards canon as the fourth part. Working together with foreign cooperation partners allows you to get a better understanding of what has actually already been discussed in specific committees. And this might, again, this sounds maybe a bit dull, but this is important because very often, your reputation also is not really growing when you make claims or make proposals that every other one in the room already knows has already been discussed. It's these types of practices that we argue are key from the Chinese side. And if I have one more minute, then I would quickly talk about the German side. So, in the German context, this cooperation has never been uncontested. No worries. So it has never been uncontested. This cooperation has always been controversial. If you look at the China-German relations in a more broader context, with regards to how is the perspective within among the among the German political elite in mainstream discourse, you could argue that 2017 was actually kind of a turning point. 2017 was the year where China has invested by far the most in Europe, or at least the figures in Germany say that. Whereas later on it went down again. There was the overtake of KUKA, a robotics producer, by a Chinese investor that kind of, took everyone seemingly by surprise. And that all contributed to a change in discourse about cooperation with China. So it was not uncontested, I want to say that. However, at the same time, German representatives also see a value in this cooperation, of course. And this is, we argue, that first and foremost, the attempt to socialize China within the existing institutions, within the existing standard developing institutions. The biggest nightmare with regards to China, if you ask a Dean representative, the German national SDO, is that China leaves the existing arrangement of international standard development organization, that China goes it alone, that China, starts to cooperate alone on its own with a regional standards organization that might include other global south countries. This would be a disaster. This would be arguably a disaster for all of us, because it would mean different standard worlds, something we don't want. But it's also a disaster from the perspective of people involved, in the sense of it has huge economic and political consequences if China does that, because then German products that are, for instance, to be sold in this specific area where this new standard organization is in charge, that would be a huge difficulty, obviously, for German companies to adapt to that, and so forth. And the final point on this, really the final sentence, Germany is, to some way, it shares features with other European countries when it comes to the relationship with China in standardization. But I would argue that there is something specific to Germany, which is Germany, in the current system of international standardization, is occupying an enormous important role. So if you consider the size of the German economy, then the size of Germany's impact in international standardization is in no relation to that. So it's by far bigger than the economic size of Germany is. And Germany has the most to lose if the existing system of standardization is put into question, is becoming fragmented, and so forth. So we saw this as one of the key points from the German side.
Fascinating, thanks so much. I'm going to chow, but I'm going to already give you a fast forward. I'm going to ask you soon for a question, and to define the standard of a question. That's one sentence with a question mark at the end when the tone goes up. Yeah, so you can already prepare. I'm sure. Standard conformity, we'll go there.
Hey, we need an agreement on that. We don't have it.
Well, that depends. This is a de jure standard set from the jury. What a benevolent one. What impact did the EU 2020 standardization strategy have on the collaboration with China? Because we talk a lot about made in China and how that is now being overcome, but now the US and Europe also came with their strategies. Are they playing up in one concert? Are they competing? Or do we see a new standardization landscape already emerging?
What a good question. And this leads me to add something, add a new perspective to our discussion. Although the standardization, their foundation is, of course, technical. It's quite hardcore. But if we look at the 2022 EU standardization strategy, the scope goes beyond that. It includes core values such as national security and also good governance principles. So it also has a social and governance, other normative dimensions to this whole process. Excuse me. Back to your question, I'd like to start with image. I assume every face on this slide is familiar to the colleagues. This is this April in Beijing. Chinese President Xi met the European leaders from France and the European Commission. China's stance towards this whole international standard setting is in consistency with its overarching principle, which is to build the political trust, which is lacking now between China and the EU, and to enhance mutual collaboration. On the other hand, on the other side of the negotiation table is the Europe, especially the president of the European Commission. She believed some focuses should be placed on economic prosperity, democracy, and other core values upheld in EU. And that will not be bought by the Chinese counterpart. Any discussion, any intention to invoke political change or in the eyes of the European leaders, political refinement will not be happening. And now you have this divergence. And if the standard setting process is only if the disagreement in this whole process is so major, China will simply withdraw from the whole process. This is not some imagination. This is already happening. We are living in this ongoing history. Back to the point you are making, China may set up some regional standards playing with African brothers. That is only part of what is happening. China is already setting up not only regional but global standards, especially in the key sectors where Chinese companies already enjoy monopoly, such as the global supply chain of the batteries for the EV, electronic vehicles, and also the mineral, chemical, and metal global supply chains. Chinese companies almost have the deciding voice in those key sectors. This is the picture of a seminar we had with our colleagues from Nankai University. Nankai University is the key research base funded by the Chinese Chamber for the commerce of chemical, metal, and mineral importers and exporters, because across the globe, that chamber, with the membership of over 1,070 Chinese companies, is already enjoying global monopoly. And what they propose is not a matter of willingness of China, but China now already has the competency, has the ability to amend. If the amendment is not possible, then to reshape the global supply chain standards. In 2015, the main proposal is from our colleagues in Nankai. They proposed the Chinese due diligence guideline for the global mineral supply chains together with the OECD research teams. And that guideline was adopted in 2016, applicable to all Chinese companies operating in this mineral supply chain and also other collaborating companies with a close tie with the Chinese companies. So this is a global re-standarding effort is already evolving. We were also approached by the China Textile Union. They want us to study the newly adopted European Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is already effective this year. They want us to identify the weaknesses in that EU-led sustainability reporting framework and how can Chinese companies propose their agenda in a way that is in compliance with the OECD guideline and also promoting the competitiveness of the Chinese companies. So all those initiatives are already put into practice.
Could you elaborate on what weaknesses means?
For instance, when you have the EU corporate sustainability reporting, you have data. And where do you gather the data? Is that from international NGOs such as Amnesty International, which always has a very critical view on the Chinese entities? Or would you rather collect data from mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, have indirect contacts with the laborers there? So that is a matter of how do you collect your data, how you verify your data, and how you make sense of the whole performance of the companies. So that is something the Chinese companies want to do. They want an alternative, even a revolution, a renewing reporting standards.
I can ask questions about all this all night long. I've been doing this for years and will continue to do so, but I will also want to give you the possibility to do so. Please, go ahead.
Yeah. So China has been making monopolies and is threatening to use them, and is also a totalitarian state with social credit scores, etc. And so if you said about there's suspicion and there is trust, there were two words that you used, suspicion and trust. Yes, of course. So I want to live in a free world, and I want my children and grandchildren to live in a free world. If China would, how does all this fit in? Because I don't want all this technology in this industry 4.0 to be used to become a totalitarian society. You understand?
That was a clear question, almost one sentence. Rogier, will you take it?
Where do we start? The social credit system isn't what you think it is. I've spent years of my life trying to work on that. There is no nationwide social scoring system. It just isn't there. By the way, I share your concerns about totalitarian states, but it turns out that our free way of life depends on the immiseration of millions of people around the world anyway. So if you want to live in a free world, I very clearly invite you to remove pretty much every manufactured product from your home, because most of it, at least partially, is produced in slave circumstances. But to get to the grist of your question, China is indeed building up monopolies, and it's interesting to compare some of the export control measures on minerals that were announced recently and compare those with the semiconductor sanctions that the United States have imposed. The US and its allies, of which the Netherlands is one, have elected to essentially effect a strategy of denial, where what they are trying to achieve is to say that the Chinese industrial base simply will not have the capability of manufacturing semiconductors at the, I believe it's a 14 millimeter node and beyond, right? And the gamble is that by starving China from access to global technologies, finance, resources, components, and all the rest of it, that a ceiling will be imposed on China's semiconductor capabilities. We can probably have a very long discussion about how successful that will be. I would be hesitant to bet against China, because the only problem that they have to solve is a technical problem. It's a problem that's been solved before. All the patents are public. The roadmap is well known. And already the rapid development of the Chinese semiconductor industry suggests that if you take tens of thousands of very clever engineers and you give them access to unlimited wealth and state resources, they can actually do a whole bunch of interesting things.
But it will postpone. That's the oil.
No, well, it will briefly postpone. China, on the other hand, where their export controls in minerals are not aimed at denial, they're aimed at upselling. Because China would rather sell us the batteries that are made with the minerals, and would even rather more sell us the cars that the batteries are mounted into. And it's actually part of a very clever industrial strategy. China's per capita GDP is a quarter that of the Netherlands, even after 40 years of breakneck economic growth. This is, by the way, I think the structural reason why we're suddenly all getting our knickers in a twist. We were fine trade integrating with China as long as China was poor and as long as China could make cheap products for us. Our China problem is our addiction to cheap stuff. It's a problem that we have created, or at least that we are to a very, very significant degree responsible for. Now that China is at the point where they need to move up the value chain, how do you do that? Standardization, because intellectual property is valuable. The global north, which is essentially the West and Japan, cashes about 93% of global IP revenues per year. China has 3%. Of global IP revenues per year. China wants some of that action, because China recognizes that even when you manufacture quite sophisticated stuff for others, you don't get rich. You buy an iPhone for $1,000 in the shop around the corner, about 15 to 20 euros of that money ends up in China. Chinese policymakers want more, because what China wants is not to own the world. China does not have totalitarian globalizing intentions.
How do you know?
How do you know? Yeah, sorry.
Because
I'm so convinced about that. About
Pardon?
any country. You're very critical about the United States, which is
Yes.
apparently crap. But China is...
No, I'm not...
I just want to know why you are so convinced that China does not, which would be understandable, want to be a global actor and determine what happens in the world. Why are you so absolutely sure about that?
Let me put it like this. When I read the United States National Security Strategy, it talks a lot about American values, American democracy, democratic ideas, American ideas about economy being exported around the world. You read the Chinese National Security Strategy, nothing in there. China simply does not have an agenda for international governance.
If you don't write it down, it isn't there.
Exactly, because the Communist Party of China is an organization that has more members in it than there are Germans in Germany. You simply cannot keep a secret in an organization like that when you're talking about your strategic line. If you want to run an organization competently, you need to tell that organization what's expected of it. And because otherwise it cannot behave that way. And all the rest is just conspiracy thinking.
No, you're naive.
Yeah, I would just like to add here, and maybe from a slightly different angle, because while I agree with actually a lot what Roger just said, I also do understand the fear that you just put into words, right? I understand the fear because that's also
Concern.
or concern. Yeah, that's also a concern that is, you know, a concern that doesn't come from nowhere, a concern that we are confronted with, again, when we open the newspaper. I don't know if even anyone reads newspapers anymore, but you know what I mean, right? Open Twitter or X or whatever it's called.
I call it X-social media.
Yeah. Whatever you're using, wherever you get your news from, but you know, it comes from somewhere. So I get the concern. I want to put it to a different level, and that's why I tried to, at the introduction, to talk not only about China, but about the context. And that is, if we look at standardization processes, it's, you know, important to ask who are actually the people that decide over those standards. And the key thing here is the people that decide over standards are, correct me if you know I'm wrong, the largest majority of them are engineers from companies that aim to generate profit by getting involved in standards. And this profit objective is, I would argue, no different between what Huawei is doing, or might be doing, and what Ericsson is doing, what Nokia is doing, and you name the companies that are, in that particular case, involved in ICT standards, right? And I personally would say, I understand the concern, but I would, you know, highlight the fact that I think the concern should more be how transparent, how open these standardization processes are. Who is actually involved in these, you know, super technical conversations that, you know, a normal person that is not, you know, engaged with the specific technology has no chance to understand after, you know, only after you do that work. And that, I would say, is a problem. That, I would say, is a much more structural problem beyond China versus, you know, do Chinese companies behave different than US companies in international standardization organizations? I don't think so. You know?
It's really interesting to see how European companies are now accusing China of behavior that European companies were accused by American companies not very long ago of committing.
Exactly. So, and I think that's a key point. And again, I'm always talking too long, but one last sentence, just to give you an example. So we were talking about the European standardization strategy issued in February 2022, right? So, or March. And there's a lot that we can discuss on here. There's different, you know, not everyone likes the content of it. It's not uncontested. But one of the very specific elements of it, amongst many others, and probably not the most important, but that doesn't, you just don't care at the moment, is the installation of what is called a high-level forum. So basically a forum on the level of, let's say, you know, it's on the commission level, if you like, on the European level, where experts are invited to discuss what are, you know, strategically, in response to China's rise, but also to other players, what are strategically most important topics that, you know, European actors should be involved in. And again, if you look at this is all public. If you look at I think it's 55 members, it's officially 60 members institution. If you look at the members, then you'll see There's some consumer associations, I think 2 or 3, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it's 4, I don't know, but you get the idea. But most is industry associations. And industry associations represent what they represent the interests of the companies in that particular industry, right? So again, I would say the more structural issue is who is actually involved. Like, where are members of the civil society, whatever that is, you know, again, that's a separate discussion, but where are other experts that would think about values that are always inscribed in standards and that take care of that? I think that's a more important issue, actually, than to pick, you know, one actor and look at this behavior.
I want to make a quick gathering of hands, so we gather a couple of questions, because I want to... Until what time do we have time? Oh, okay, very good. So I'm going to take... So who has a question? 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to take those 3, starting here. And remember, the question was? 1 sentence, question mark. Yeah, very good. Go ahead.
1 sentence. I hear the story of the raw materials not for the first time. World domination, all of these things, but we have a climate issue on world level. Is it thinkable that we can say some subjects we don't compete?
That's a good question. Very nice. Let's sit on that a bit while we get the second question from there.
I can also speak loudly.
No, because there are people online, and we want for the future generations to have this.
Fair enough, thanks. My question is, well, in 1 sentence, to what extent would you say that European insistence on Western values, if you will, is inhibiting productive conversation on standard and on collaboration within standards?
If I understood Zhao well, we don't meant that the court presidents don't ask ChatGPT or another software tool to write the rulings. Why wouldn't each of those 4 court presidents from the Netherlands have one judge do all the rulings by head and make at the same time some internet tool do the same work and then compare the 2? But what would be the problem if you would do that in the Netherlands?
You can pick one of the 3 or a combination, because...
I can start with there because that speaks to the heart of my work. I think it's a lack of willingness. It's not because of lack of money, lack of institutional support. I recently had a very big firm in Amsterdam with a lot of business of Chinese companies. I raised this question: isn't that more appealing if you try to convince a international commercial court to have this e-procedure? Efficient, low cost, then you just sell that point, yeah, fast. And also it's benefiting the local residents, right, who want to pay that much of money for each case. And you say, no, even during the corona, that was kind of the supplement. You have Zoom collecting your questions, but the paperwork was still done in a traditional way. In contrast, in China, that is the guidance, that is the requirement. The Chinese judges have to report to the president of court how many cases have been heard, trialed online. And I think this whole institutional awareness or push is really on the different levels. In China, as a judge, you have to do it. It is not a supplement, but that is part of your current and future work. Whereas in Netherlands, in UK, in France, the e-justice is still treated as a little game. If you want to play with it, you can choose, but there's no order to do it in a digital way, which is a pity.
Would you also be so kind to perhaps make a start, because you already mentioned the role of values in standardization and how it might actually hamper further negotiation and collaboration between EU and China?
I collect several almost emotional responses from the gentleman in the room. I can understand the concern. And when I look at the very fierce response from President von der Leyen, I can understand her because she is not in isolation from the general settlements in Europe. She is kind of reflecting those very deep-rooted, also to a certain extent, reasonable suspicions. But that is really a matter of what we want and what can we do. If we random quiz to the colleagues here, every day the business conducted between China and the EU in the unit of euro, how much is it? Every single day between China and the EU. There's no corporal punishment if you give a wrong answer. Huge, yes? How huge?
Oh, give me a number. Come on, people. Are you awake?
1 billion a day.
1 billion a day? 45 million?
Yeah?
40 million? 400 million?
Yeah? 1.9 billion. One single day. So it's really not about, I don't like Chinese monopoly. No one likes monopoly. That is why we have anti-competition law, right, at national and international levels. And in 2019, the whole Europe kind of subscribed to canceling China's strategy, which is already being adjusted, simply because the reality is no one can afford canceling China. And we can do within this boundary, okay, if you want to do the labor standardization, as Chinese companies, what do you want? And you have to enter the negotiation, try to make sure China is kept in this whole table. And it would be not, I think it's a loss for both sides if we say, okay, you are too dangerous, we just leave you alone. No one can leave China alone.
Competition and collaboration. What does BMW think about it? Sorry.
I won't answer that question. Oh, yeah, that's true. But I still won't answer. I don't want to put myself in the skin of a BMW rep. But I would like to say a sentence or two on the question of values, because in my understanding, or first of all, the problem at the moment is not, I would say, who asked the question? The problem is not a lack of cooperation. I wouldn't say that that's the problem. So again, the basic understanding of international standardization is that it is a voluntary and collaborative endeavor, right? So the key question I think that we should ask is, or that people involved in developing standardization strategies ask, is how actually to bring all actors to the table. That's the question, not the other way around. So you can only discuss, if you do that, that's a different question, but the precondition for thinking about certain values in certain standards is to have the people on the table that decide on these standards. And I think that's key. And that's again why I would say that from sort of the perspective of standard setters in Germany that we interviewed in our research, a key goal is to actually have China on the table, to keep China socialized, if you like, in these international organizations, because then you can have a discussion on these on values as well that are inscribed. If standards are, de facto standards because of a monopoly of a certain company, there is no way that you can actually discuss in a certain kind of open setting about what values that might include. So I think that's key. I don't know if I answered your question there, but I think when it comes to values, it's those international organizations. The thing is, as I said in the earlier comment, who are the participants? Are these only private company representatives, or are other other values from other civil society actors actually also being considered?
The gentleman's question about green tech essentially had gone unaddressed so far, so I'd like to pick that up first. should we not collaborate, particularly when it comes to decarbonization? If Louis Armstrong was right and it actually was a wonderful world, then I would say yes. But the problem is that, the energy coefficient of human development has never decreased. And as we continue to require more and more energy, and if that energy is going to be more and more electricity, then we can be damn sure that the geopolitics of oil today will be reproduced in the geopolitics of minerals and metals and solar panels tomorrow. From the Chinese perspective, one of the things that they do as part of an industrial policy is that they are seeking areas where they can gain a lead in areas where competition is less severe. So, for instance, when you look at cars, why is one of the reasons that China has skyrocketed from not being in the top 15 of car exporting countries to 5 years ago to number 1 now? It's very simple. China saw that it could not compete in a completely saturated market for petrol vehicles, but it did see that with a nationwide investment in an infrastructure, an ecosystem, a supply chain for EV batteries, in combination with huge Chinese consumer demand for smart cars, ends up with a result that you now have a Chinese EV ecosystem which is literally world-beating. And I was in Beijing last week. Frankly, when you look at the in-car software, it beats anything that any German or French or Italian car maker, to name the European countries, can offer. And you're going to see similar things with regards to energy production, where you know how businesses like to say that they can do well by doing good? Well, China wants to, on the one hand, China politically wants to decarbonize. There's a couple of important reasons for that. And one of that is that it has become clear to policymakers in Beijing that China will not be able to deindustrialize in very many activities in the way that Europe and the United States have. There is no country like China for China, in the sense that for us, China was a place to which we could outsource unpleasant industries because of poor labor conditions, poor pay, poor environmental consequences, and so on and so forth. There is no country available to China to do that, which means that China will have to find ways to make those industries more politically acceptable to that part of its population that has to work there or that has to live around these factories, which means that it is forced to invest in things like decarbonization, automation, and so on and so forth. But that then means that suddenly you have a whole range of industrial competences that are also very valuable. Again, if we essentially lay claim to the level of prosperity that we have, then we have no moral claim to deny that to anybody else in the world who wants it, including the Chinese. And the Chinese agree. They want to become as prosperous as us. And if that means that they have to eat our lunch when it comes to green tech, they will.
If we talk about just transition, what does it mean for European perspective and for Chinese perspective?
What do you mean with that?
It's a worldwide issue. So if the poor countries, if the rich countries, if the poor countries and the rich countries, there's a big battle.
Let's before we go to the equal distribution of resources, power, and possibilities.
One of the smaller questions.
Get a few other questions, because we're nearing the end, and I want to have everyone the possibility to partake in. There's definitely this complexifying issue of the world. So we will not solve things, but I think we already learned a lot. So that's excellent. But we want to learn more from you as well.
I have a question about South Korea, because it was mentioned by Daniel Fuchs about that they also have an important role in technology standards. And concomitant to that, I'd like to know, you mentioned VHS, Rogier Kremers, that Betamax lost out. And my understanding is that Betamax was actually a better technology. So how do you ensure that the technology standard that's determined or agreed on is the best technology there is?
And I think we had a question here in the front.
Yeah, but you make me do it in one sentence, which is a really difficult comma.
Yeah, this is the academic's nightmare.
Yeah.
This is why I love it.
So I just asked one of the 6 questions that I had, and it's basically that there was this EU-China high-level digital dialogue that took place and now has been rejuvenated. And I was wondering if you could comment on that, because you commented on the European standardization strategy. I was just wondering if that might be a space that actually opens up dialogue, question mark?
Okay, so there are different kinds of distribution, I think, in the region between China and Korea, but perhaps also other countries, as we got from there.
No, Japan hasn't been mentioned.
Exactly. Thank you. Japan, Vietnam, Laos, Korea.
Singapore,
the Singapore, the region in itself also is a complexity in itself. So it's like it becomes a bit of a fractal now. But yes. So to connect a bit, so let's complicate it a bit more while we're at it, and maybe take a few of the questions of distribution and what are the measures and means to do that. Would someone want to take that? Yeah. Just putting something, and you can say whatever you want.
Well, I'm happy to talk about sort of the idea of integration. One of the things that we've started to see emerge over the last couple of years or so is this idea of a sort of a Chinese approach to an integrated value chain rather than a globally distributed value chain. And partially that is a response, obviously, to economic securitization, where China sees that its access to global markets, resources, and all the rest of it is being curtailed. But also it's a response to some of these imperatives that I just mentioned. You know, there simply aren't places to which China can export polluting industries, so it has to do something about that. I would argue that the overarching structural problem that all of us are dealing with, and climate change is a big part of that, is that we are now all jostling for position to capture the commanding heights of the economy of the future. And every economy has its ecosystem where you have apex predators and you have bottom feeders, right? If you're going to have a semiconductor industry, you're going to have businesses like ASML or like TSMC that shovel in god-awfully large amounts of cash, and you're having African kids digging cobalt out of the ground in rather unfortuitous circumstances. They're all part of the same ecosystem. And yes, ASML and TSMC are essential to the functioning of the ecosystem, but so is the African child labor, right? And none of us seems to be able or willing to solve that problem. The political imperative that China faces, given the fact that a lot of this stuff happens on Chinese territory, is to, also for reasons of things like, you know, the labor age population going down, Chinese people too, sort of climbing the Maslowian pyramid. The domestic political pressure that the leadership faces is to take these very, very unpleasant jobs that it does not want to deplace or it doesn't want to outsource out of China. And it somehow needs to make them acceptable. That is going to be a very, very massive thing. Now, when it comes to the distribution of wealth and resources, there was a really interesting article a couple of months ago in American Affairs, which is called The Long, Slow Death of Globalization, and I love a poetic title like that. But the idea is that we always talk about how the Chinese process of industrialization has, how shall we put it, it hasn't just deindustrialized, say, the American heartland, or Europe for that matter, it's also deindustrialized the rest of the global south. And that's an aspect that is also, I think, completely understudied, but if China truly is becoming this powerhouse that's going to do everything, and that is going to have these vertically integrated industries, it means that this traditional pattern of development that we saw in places like Korea, Taiwan, Japan, where they start out making toys and sneakers, and as they move up the value chains, they leave the toys and sneakers behind, so other countries can start with the toys and sneakers and move up and so on and so forth. that model simply doesn't apply to China. And that means that we have to start talking about scale, right? The scale of China is completely different to the scale of any other country. The amount of people, what is it? China has twice as many delivery drivers for food delivery as there are Belgians. That is that is the sort of thing we're talking. I used to make these jokes about British politics. You know, there are more men named David in cabinet than women. But
one too many.
But so that is then the interesting thing when we talk about global equity, where China is sucking all of these things in, and some of, say, clothing manufacturing has gone to places like Bangladesh, but it seems that China is like the sponge surrounded by a perfect membrane where things can go in, but pretty much nothing really comes out. Now that then must lead us to the final question, which is we seem to be living in this illusion that all countries can climb up the value chain in the same way that we pretend in this country that everyone can go to university, and then we complain that we don't have proper plumbers anymore, or at least not for a decent price, and you know they come within 3 months when you call them. So we really also need to rethink, I think, this ecosystemic approach to global technology, and in my view, ideally, I would like that African kid to at least be given some proper gloves when they're when they're digging the cobalt out of the ground, and even more nicely, a decent wage. Wouldn't that be great?
I'm going to give you a few more last words, and then I'm going to ask you, what should we read, watch, or understand to understand better? Because clearly we are not at the end. You are the experts. What should we read? It can be something of you, something you've read. How can we educate ourselves to continue thinking about these problems?
Already this round or in the last round?
You first say some final things, and then we do a last round with the recommendations.
Saying some final things is always very difficult. For those who are here in the room, I'm going to stay a bit for further discussion if you're interested. I actually, and that's a bit of a jump from what you just said, admittedly, but I would like to take up the mentioning of Japan, and that was related to the question, how can we ensure what is the best technology, right? So the reference to Japan I would like to use to again highlight that although, for instance, in the ICT sector, there is a large amount of competition between Chinese firms and firms in other East Asian countries. China has been involved in cooperation agreements with Japan and South Korea as well. So over the past 2 decades already, several different forms and forums of cooperation between Japan, South Korea, and China have existed. The assessment of this is a bit disputed, but the claim is that through this cooperation there have been already some collective proposals for standards on a global level. So there is, to an extent, a productive collaboration despite the context of competition, even in East Asia, and that should not be confused with separate regional forms of standardization, but rather working within the region, and from the Chinese perspective, again, working with companies in the region from other states from which you can learn, collaborate, and then propose standards, again, for instance, at the ISO or at the IEC collectively. That has happened, and that such things continue to happen despite all the talk about geopolitical rivalry, right? When I talk to engineers and I ask them, so yeah, what about the newest trade war measures taken by the US government? How does this impact your work in collaboration with your partners in Germany and in the US? The answer would be, there is no impact, because we have to do that. Standardization is such a foundational work that we continue to do. And so I think maybe that's a good final statement, because it maybe gives some hope that there's some cooperation, at least. And I give you the word so that I can think about recommended readings.
Thank you for that ending question. I always have a pragmatic mind, so I'm always looking at what can we do, what kind of change can we make. In terms of reading, I would recommend you to read people if you can, rather than news. I would recommend you to read people's actions rather than people's rhetorics. More specifically, a very good friend of mine, Peter Gale, just published a book called West Meets East. That is based on immersive experiences living in Taiwan, mainland China. If you really meet people, learning about their struggles, learning about their plans, then you can see a different part of what you would read from news. And the other tip I have is to find the right person, find the right storytelling. Whenever I read news about President von der Leyen, I always speak to myself, so as a politician, as the leader of the Europe, do you just want to make a claim or do you want to reach some actionable conclusion? Of course, it's important to emphasize democracy, to emphasize good governance, but at the table with the Chinese president, this is not a debating table. This is determining the future of very powerful regions. If you just stick to your rhetoric, that will not be subscribed to by the Chinese president, and then you are not really a good negotiator, not a very good politician. Very briefly, an example from my previous project, Socializing China in the International Rule of Law Regime. China always claimed, okay, do not educate us on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That was kind of a product of Western colonial powers. And then we looked into the records of drafting and debating. It turns out one of the drafting members is actually Dr. Zhang Pengchun from China. Article 1, all humans are endowed with reason and conscience and should be treated in the spirit of brotherhood. It is from Zhang Pengchun, recording the Confucius value of Ren. Then we mentioned this to the Chinese senior officials. Do not reject this part. This is a glorious part of Chinese contribution to the international human rights development. And in 2017, statue of Dr. Zhang Pengchun was erected on the campus of Nankai. You know, in China, if you want to have a big statue, you have to be Mao Zedong perhaps. And that is really a good recognition of Chinese role in human rights. Currently, it is still within the academic circle. It is within human rights policy offices. But this is my hope, and I do believe if you try to stick to the right storytelling, find the right people, Chinese people, they are just as smart as Dutch people. They want a free world. They want some rule-binding implementers. And if we can help, if we can act, why not?
In my closing remarks, I came to the conclusion that we hadn't yet addressed the question of the gentleman over there, which is how do we make sure that the best technology wins? And the answer is you don't. You know, it's like the Dutch elections from 2 weeks ago. Regardless of what you think about the outcome, you either believe in democracy or you don't. Same thing with technologies. You either believe in the market or you don't. And in a way, this gives us hope, or at least this should allay some of our concerns, right? It's because very often it's, you know, I read so much like Beijing has these plans to, you know, standardize and all the rest of it, and to become a dominant force in standardization. Point is, the market, not the Chinese Communist Party, determines which standardized technologies will be successful. I'm old enough to remember things like zip drives and Firewire 800 and a whole raft of other standardized technologies that are, you know, on the graveyard of standardized technologies and that never really became successful. So we sometimes confuse the ability to standardize a technology with actual success in a competitive marketplace. That's part of the answer. But, you know, when we talk about Betamax and VHS, we're talking about, you know, some things like video quality and, you know, the amount of noise that it makes. When we talk about very important standards like 5G, then we are also obviously talking about things that might be important, like security. And then the answer is, in the very classical European tradition, you regulate. And I do think, particularly where it comes to new technology, we are now sort of working through the hangover of the techno-optimist party that we had in the 1990s and 2000s when, you know, remember when Elon Musk was still cool? And when Facebook was connecting people around the world? And now we're at this point where this new sphere turned out to be, you know, the triumphalism, I would say, of the digital world of that era seems to have come crashing down upon us in no small degree. And part of the answer is, as it has always been, if you want to maintain minimum standards, you regulate, because market actors cannot be trusted to do the right thing for the common good if it doesn't show up in the bottom line. Always has been thus, always will be thus. And I guess part of the problem is that in the post-Cold War era, our state intervention, state action muscles atrophied, and we lost the ability, we essentially drove our societies like a cheap rental car. We thought the market would figure everything out and that technology would figure everything out, and that the role of government was to sort of twiddle some buttons here and there and maybe collect some taxes every now and then, but turns out that the Dutch government isn't that very good at that either. We need to recognize that the state has a role to play here, and yes, I know that the state is a deeply, deeply flawed human institution. That is because it is human, and every human institution is deeply, deeply flawed. But it's the best we've got. Then on recommendations, obviously I'm going to be scandalous and reiterate the fact that my colleagues and myself have just got a book out. It's called The Emergence of China's Smart State. And it studies from a variety of perspectives how China actually became the digital power that it is. If you Google it, you will also find on the publisher's webpage or on my LinkedIn, if you follow that, there's a link because thanks to the generosity of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the online version is free of charge. But what I think is even more important is that even though we are talking about sort of cutting edge stuff and new technologies, all of the things that we're talking about are not new. Pretty much every question we've asked, we've seen this movie before. So my recommendation would be, every so often, switch off your neo-maniacal focus on what it, on the bright, shiny thing in front of you. Read history. Human beings do not change, and the way that human beings respond to threats, concerns, the impacts of new technologies, and so on and so forth, haven't really changed the last 2,000 years either. You want to read a great debate? Read the Han Dynasty, 1800 years old, debates on salt and iron, and there you have industrial policy. So I think we should sometimes be modest, and it's not because these are the challenges that confront us now that makes us special in any way.
I'll just finish with recommendations, final recommendations, maybe, if I'm allowed to. Rogier already mentioned his book that came out that is definitely to be recommended. But I also want to take the opportunity to refer to the work of the others that are here on the panel. So you should definitely also read Tsungu's work. And, by the way, also the work of our moderator, because Niels himself has also published quite a lot on standards. Which is very interesting, which tries also to figure out how standards, infrastructure, and power are related. Go and read that. And beyond, I would always suggest and highly recommend to read scholars from the region that we're actually dealing with. So in the Chinese case, one scholar, there's much more obviously, but one scholar focusing specifically on tech standards is Wang Ping. If anyone wants further information on specific papers, hit me up after the event. I think he's retired now, but worked for a standards institution for a very long time, and has also published not only in Chinese but also in English. And in the South Korean case, there is a scholar named Lee He-jin that I can also recommend to everyone, that he looks at both China and South Korea in international text standards. Thanks.
I want to thank you. I want to thank you so much for your attention, which is special. You came at the end of a probably long day. You've worked all day, but you came here and you sat down and to listen to hear what other people thought. I respect that. Thank you that you came. Thanks so much for the speakers that you brought up your time, that you spent so much time thinking about these arcane things that are actually very important. And so now all to the bar. Thank you.
Yeah.